criminals are stupid.
Yeah, no, I personally never found that. And for example, there was a chap came to me and said, you have to give me something because if you don't give me something, I'm going to go and attack a child sex offender in the prison. They were kept apart because they would be immediately attacked. But anyway, he said, I'm going to kill one if I get hold of one, if you don't do something. And I said, well, let's think about this. He said, well, why do you feel like that? And he said, well, because they interfere with kiddies, with children. And so I took a bit of a risk. I said, do you have any children? And he said, yes, 3. I said, how many mothers? And he said, well, 3. I said, these mothers, do they have boyfriends? And they said, yes. And I said, 1 or perhaps more? Have they had more than one? And they said, yes. I said, well, is it likely that 1 or more of these boyfriends has sexually interfered with one of your children? And he immediately got the point. And I said, well, you're not you haven't interfered sexually with children yourself, but you've facilitated you've created the conditions in which such behavior is likely to occur. Now it's too late. You can't do anything about it now. It's too late, but you can make sure that you don't do anything to further it in the future. And he went out. There was no more talk about killing sex abusers.
Why do you think you got away with that?
Got away with?
Well, you said you took a risk, right? So
I took a risk. I took a risk. I mean, it was a risk that I didn't know that he had children. I didn't know I had a fair idea because it was so common amongst prisoners. Sure. And outside prison.
But it's also a risk. I mean, the risk you took, he asked you to do something because he was going to become murderous. And so that's a pretty salient, immediate, and credible threat, given that a violent criminal uttered it in a prison.
Yes.
And your response wasn't, I better prescribe him a sedative, at least to cover myself up, let's say, if anything does happen. Your response was, well, let's call this guy out for his rather self-evident moral flaws, blind ignorance of which is facilitating an unearned sense of homicidal moral superiority. And let's assume that that's going to be curative. That's a risk.
Yeah, it's a risk. And I must say that when I had quite a few patients who said similar things. And I didn't give in to what was, in essence, moral blackmail. But of course, it did always occur to me that maybe one day one of these people who was threatening something like that might actually commit the act, and then someone might blame me. I mean,
yes, definitely.
That never happened. That never happened. But I was fairly clear that their responsibility was not to behave like that, and he didn't, in my opinion, as far as I could tell, suffer from anything which would have excused him.
Right, some organic impulse control disorder, some prefrontal damage, or I mean, those things do occur. A certain percentage of violent criminals have rage that's induced by epilepsy, and that can be triggered by drinking. And I mean, there are organic syndromes that mimic virtually every moral failing.
Yeah, if he had a psychosis, for example, I mean, if he'd had a psychosis, I wouldn't have said what I said.
My sense in reading your books is, so there is this censoriousness, or that's something you could be criticized about for. And I'm sure, and you can tell me about that, I'm sure you have been criticized for that. And you know, you've written provocative tracts like The Toxic Cult of Sentimentality, which is a real dagger in some sense. I mean, because people, let's not call it sentimentality for a moment, let's call it empathy or sympathy. And you make a case that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that excessive empathy, unthinking sympathy can produce catastrophic consequences because it's not tempered by judgment. And then I look at the personality literature. You know, we have two moral personality traits, roughly speaking. One is agreeableness. And so people who are high in agreeableness are empathetic and sympathetic and self-sacrificing and perhaps resentful because of it. So it's not an untrammeled virtue, whereas the disagreeable types are more likely to be imprisoned. So that's a predictor of antisocial behavior. But they're implacable and stubborn and hard to push around. And so people vary on that distribution. I think agreeableness is the empathy dimension is a trait that's particularly good for fostering the care of infants, because infants, immediate empathy with an infant under 6 to 9 months is almost invariably the right response. If the infant is crying or in distress, your job isn't to question or judge, it's to alleviate the source of the trouble. And it's very hard to take care of infants, and it's no wonder that there's a moral virtue that's essentially devoted to the care of true dependence. But we have conscientiousness too. And conscientiousness is the best predictor of long-term life success apart from IQ. And conscientious people are good at formulating and keeping contracts, long-term contracts. It's sort of a cold virtue, and they are judgmental. But as far as I'm concerned, we wouldn't have both these personality traits. Like they're 2 of 5. So it's not like it's a trivial proportion of the variation in personality. We wouldn't have 2 of our 5 personality traits aimed at regulating our behavior if empathy alone was sufficient. And so you go after it, the toxic cult of sentimentality. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean if you like, the infantilization of people who are expressing emotion. So we accept now that if someone expresses distress, we don't inquire where that distress comes from, how it arose. We just simply try to alleviate it. And, Oscar Wilde, of course, said that sentimentality is the desire